And what about the other stuff like the cold exposure? What's your opinion on that one?
Yeah, so as you said, those are coming from this perspective of hormesis, which is the idea that a little bit of something damaging, stressful, or toxic causes a defensive reaction in our bodies that makes us stronger and better able to adapt to further damage and stress, and that's a good thing. And not only is that a good thing, but that is the way to health. And we can talk about the specifics here, right? I mean, low carb is something that fits into something that's hormetic, and I think it can have benefits. I don't think any of those benefits are because of hormesis, right? We talked about things like the gut and a number of others. I have I would say everything about the bioenergetic perspective is basically anti-hormesis on a fundamental principle level, not necessarily on a practical level. And the reason why I make that distinction is because this doesn't mean we don't want to ever do anything that causes stress. Stress is going to happen with beneficial things like exercise and anything that happens in our life. There's going to be some level of stress, but that doesn't mean that the stress is what accounts for the benefits. And that's the idea behind hormesis. And I would say it's actually a very, very dangerous idea. And we see that when we look through the history and look at its origins. It starts with basically the chemical industry trying to defend its pollution and the exposure that we get to heavy metals and other pollutants in food and in our environment and our water. And what they basically said was, yes, these things are really toxic in high doses, but in low doses, they're actually just causing a little bit of damage, and that causes a defensive reaction that's beneficial. So it's okay to have small amounts of these in your water and in your food, and don't worry about us polluting the environment. That's the origin story of hormesis. And then since then, it's been extrapolated into this idea where, as we were talking about, certain interventions that are stressful, like fasting and cold thermogenesis, are beneficial because of the stress that they cause, not because of some other reason, but because of the stress. And it's actually morphed into something even worse, which is now, and we won't go too far down that rabbit hole because it's not what the average person is thinking of, but I think it's important to identify that this is becoming more and more dangerous over time scientifically, which is that the kind of evolution of this idea now is that anything that is beneficial is only beneficial because of the stress that it causes. Basically, the only way that something can provide benefit is through hormesis. And you see these papers, these published scientific papers, saying that the reason why water is beneficial, the reason why vitamins and minerals are beneficial, and a number of other things is because of the stress that they cause. Basically, too much of them is harmful, too little is also harmful, but you get this right zone where you're just causing enough stress, and that's how they provide benefits. And without going too far down that path, I think not only is it anti-scientific, but I think it's also a dangerous thought process that can lead to us doing some pretty ridiculous things in the name of health, or lead to, exposure to pollutants and things like that in the name of health as well. So that's kind of the extremes of it. But when we zone in on what most people are talking about in terms of hormesis, I still think that there are issues here. And so a lot of this comes back to, or someone that made this very clear is Hans Selye, who is basically the person who coined stress and our stress response. And what he identified was that every stressor that we could be exposed to, a stressor is something that uses energy and can cause stress, whether we're talking about walking or a pollutant or, heavy metal or endotoxin or a fight with a significant other, anything that can potentially cause stress has basically two different categories of effects. One of these is called the stressor effect, which is a universal effect that is the same between all these things, whether we're talking sunlight or mercury. They each have a stressor effect, which is the ability or the extent to which it requires the usage of energy, right? Both of those things will use some energy, just like, exercise would. Then there's the other side, which are called the specific effects. And these are the effects that are unique to each stimulus, right? The things that make sunlight different from mercury, which are important. And what he basically identified was that the stressor effect not only is universal between the stressors, but our response to it is universal. So if we have enough of a stressor effect, it will put us into stress. And that has downstream negative consequences, regardless of what's causing it. That is inherently negative. But the specific effects can be either positive or negative. And in some cases, they can outweigh that stress. And in some cases, they can actually make it worse. So in the case of something like a moderate amount of exercise, not something extreme, normally the specific effects, the effects on the musculature and the cardiovascular system and lymphatic system and all of these other things are really beneficial, and they outweigh the amount of stress that the exercise causes, leading to a state where exercise is beneficial. But it is beneficial despite the stress that it caused, not because of the stress that it caused. And we can say the same thing about sunlight or something like low carb, right? Where as we were discussing, we might feel a bit better because of the stress, but it's actually having a negative long-term effect. But it still might be beneficial in that the relief from endotoxin, let's say, could far outweigh the amount of stress that we're getting. And that's a case where we look at that situation, and it's not beneficial because of the stress it caused. It's not beneficial because of the reactive oxygen species and all, the activation of all these hormetic pathways, the sirtuins and the NRF2 and AMPK and all of that. It's not beneficial because of those things. It's actually beneficial because it's opposing those by providing some really beneficial specific effects. And so that is the place that I would land, of course, to kind of get into the details of why I think that's the case, and the support for it is a longer conversation, but I would say that's how I would interpret these things. And I think what that then means is we don't want to do something just because it spikes adrenaline and increases stress and we react to that in a defensive way. Rather, we'd want to do something because it actually benefits us despite stress.